to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, welcome back. You're listening to Islands at War podcast with myself, Keith Bengelli, and co-presenter Nick Lahuri.
Hi Keith, how you doing?
Not doing too badly at all. So here we are in just about to start the second part of our fortifications in Guernsey, early fortifications in Guernsey. I just thought I'd recap, Nick. We did part 1, and essentially what we're seeking to explain is that when the Germans arrived to start the occupation in 1940, they had relatively, in relative terms, a low military strength, mainly because they expected to invade the UK.
Yeah, absolutely, and they had been planning Operation Green Arrow, which was a more structured invasion of the Channel Islands, which they subsequently found out, as we kind of touched on in our first episode about the occupation of the islands. You know, they kind of arrived a bit earlier than they'd planned by accident, because they realised that there was nobody here defending the islands. So they came by air instead of coming by sea, which had been their original plan. So they would have arrived in much larger numbers initially if they'd arrived like that.
Yes, and the fact that they arrived by air often takes people by surprise. They just assume that they sort of landing craft in, but as we know, they didn't. So the thinking behind the increase in the fortifications here in advance of the Atlantic Wall, and that's the important point, is it was quite instructive to find that Hitler himself took an inordinate amount of interest in the islands, and it seems that he had it in his own mind that Sea Lion, the invasion of the UK, wasn't going to take place, but he wanted the Brits to, well, it was just the Brits, there were no allies as such then. He wanted the British to think the Sea Lion was still going to take place. He also knew, Nick, that he was going to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. So what he did is he increased the troop strength, the military presence on the island, and then started to increase the fortifications. So this is covered off initially in part 1, which is on all good
absolutely, all good podcast platforms. You can find it on Spotify
and also Gnet Radio, Mixcloud. But we have been contacted, and it's great to have people engage with us. I understand that through one way or another, Nick, and you'll explain, historian James Jeffries had a question aimed at him, which you'll explain.
I was going to say, rather than contacted, I think I barged into a conversation on social media. James Jeffries, he's a really interesting chap. What he doesn't know about the RAF during World War II is not worth knowing. He's one half of actually the Nevermind the Dam Busters podcast with Jane Gifford-Lowes as well. That's a highly recommended podcast if you're interested in what was going on in the air during World War II. And James had been asked by somebody about what if the Channel Islands had been invaded, and how would that have affected the Battle of Britain. Now, obviously, the person asking the question didn't realise that we had been invaded during that time period. So it got me thinking, and I did reply to it with a couple of links to things that I thought might be of interest. But I'm writing an article now about how the role of the Channel Islands in the Battle of Britain, the small part that was played by them, but they were used. The airfields here and in Jersey, not so much. Alderney wasn't really used because their airfield wasn't suitable, although there were seaplanes up there.
Yeah, and Guernsey Airport, of course, had only been finished in 1939. Finished and opened, so it was a brand new airport.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, brand new airport. It had been used a little bit for commercial operations up until the occupation, but not very much. I think it was September 1939. It opened around about the start of the war, actually. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I go back and just rewrite a little bit of the notes, because I know it's not technically fortifications, but it sort of is. I mean, they've got anti-aircraft guns up at the airport, and also it forms part of the defence of Guernsey in the early days. So I thought, I'll go back and rewrite part of episode 2, which you very kindly let me do, and perhaps we'll explain a little bit about what was going on with the Luftwaffe. And in fact, they were here in more numbers than anybody else. Probably not surprising, because they actually led the invasion in the end, because they used Ju-52s to bring over the troops, including motorcycles and other light equipment as well. In the initial days, but they were here in numbers because they wanted to protect the airport here. Likewise, the airport in Jersey, and the harbour was the other key area that was being protected. So they very quickly brought over with them 2-centimetre anti-aircraft batteries. That was within 4 days of arriving, which I just find is incredible that they actually managed to bring that over and have it operational in 4 days.
So these 2 batteries are actually within the perimeters of the airport.
Yeah. So then they brought over some ME-109s, which everyone will be familiar with if they've ever watched the Battle of Britain or any other film.
Oh, these are Messerschmitts.
Yeah, Messerschmitt 109 fighters. They had 2 groups, JG-27 and JG-53. Who both operated out of Guernsey. JG-53 was the first to arrive, and they're both on the order of battle for Eagle Day. The start of the Battle of Britain activity declined after the Battle of Britain had been lost effectively by the Luftwaffe, but there were lots of other aircraft coming in and out of here, or not successfully coming in and out of here.
Can I just one of the things that I seem to think is that the pilots for the Messerschmitt squadron, they were billeted in the Manor Hotel. Would that be right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right, so the Manor Hotel, for listeners, Guernsey listeners may be pleased to know that we've confirmed that for them. But also, the Manor Hotel is in a forest parish, and it's not too far from a bay called Petitbot Bay. And if you've got maps, you can see it's very near. It's south of the airport and just near the coastal area. So all aircrew, officers and such like there.
I believe it was officers in the Manor Hotel, and then the Happy Landings might have been used for other ranks.
The Happy Landing is almost exactly next to the.
Absolutely. But and that actually mirrored what the RAF did when they were here pre the invasion by the Germans. So they used the Manor House Hotel pre the occupation starting. So effectively, I think the Germans saw it as just taking over the facilities that the RAF had used, but they were the two closest hotels to be able to use for that. As I said, there were other types operating out of here as well as the fighters. The Heinkel HE-111s. There were a few that had mishaps. I think we touched on one of them last time. Locals, the Germans didn't guard it overnight, and the locals sort of helped themselves. But they're keen to repurpose things, shall we say, or get a souvenir. So that ended up under tarpaulin up at the airport for a while because the Germans didn't know what to do about it. But people had taken bits. There's some bits of it at the Occupation Museum actually. But also, there were things like a Ju-87 that was shot down near here. I'm not sure if that one was operating.
And a Ju is that's a Junkers?
Junkers, Ju-87. That was shot down, and various other things. There's lots of training aircraft and Ju-52s as well that got into a bit of bother around here. But they had lots of reconnaissance aircraft because they were still planning to go and do Operation Sea Lion.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
and the islands were used as staging points for other aircraft coming through on the way to the UK, and our airspace was used to form up. So the bombers would form up over the Channel Islands to then head on to the UK to bomb.
Yeah, so can I just focus back in on this Messerschmitt squadron and their involvement in the Battle of Britain? I mean, presumably, the Battle of the Britain is a much loved and much watched film, and we see the men being sort of sitting around in deck chairs and waiting to be scrambled. Would we have seen a sort of mirror image over here, where the crews were waiting around, they would be scrambled, or were they more? They were more sort of proactive as opposed to reactive, wouldn't they? Because they were leading the raids in.
Yeah, absolutely, more proactive. There were raids on the airport here, though, which did catch them unawares. So there was a raid in August 1940. We've talked about that one before. Well, actually, there were 3 raids in the course of 24 hours. And there were other attacks on the airport. There was one that finished off a hangar in December 1940. And various aircraft that crashed at the airport due to having been shot up by British Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Yeah, so the Messerschmitt Squadron would have had orders and given a target to go after. Typically, do you know what sort of mainland target they would have gone after?
Well, the Messerschmitts were there to escort the bombers, but they were forward based here because, of course, they've got shorter range than the bombers. Bombers would form up over the islands and then head off to the UK to go and bomb airfields at that point.
Yes, because there's a distinction between the Battle of the Britain bombing raids and the Blitz, which we'll get onto. So they would have had escort duties. Do you know anything about the attrition rates?
I don't. I do know that one of them was shot down over Kent. He had to force land and became a prisoner of war. Other than that, I don't. They moved off to North Africa after being here. So
okay, so it was North Africa that they. But I always thought it was. Well, maybe I just assumed it was in support of the Russian.
Oh yeah, some of them ended up on the Russian front, but that was later on. But yeah, the fighter squadrons from here ended up in North Africa fairly swiftly because they didn't abandon the airport, but flying operations much reduced after the Battle of Britain. But also the air raid in August 1940. There's plenty of evidence that basically they removed all of the aircraft from Guernsey Airport for a period of time because
but they did come back.
They did come back, but they removed all of the aircraft for a period of time back to France because they couldn't defend it. Okay,
so when the Blitz commenced, and the Blitz was separate to the Battle of Britain, let's say. Would that be a truth? Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean they switched from bombing the airfields to
bombing my mum.
Yeah,
in London.
Pretty much.
So would it have been the same? Would have been the same support from Guernsey, or had they already moved to North Africa?
There was still aircraft based here that would have been involved.
Okay, so going back to the question that you you came in on the side of, just remind me, was he sort of the question of James Jeffreys, was he talking about bombing raids from here?
He was thinking more, I think, the chap that asked James question, and to be fair, I haven't asked James exactly what the question was other than what I'd seen. Was would it have made a difference because of range? Now, obviously, we're a little bit further away than Normandy from the UK, or the
Calais area,
as well. So we're well south of the northernmost bits of France. So it wouldn't have actually helped because they would have needed more range to get from, it would have burnt more fuel to get from here to the UK. It does help with fighting over the Channel, I guess, but again, you're starting from a point further south. And as we've just touched on, it doesn't help prevent you from getting your airfield from getting bombed. So it's not even much help from that point of view. It would also have had the logistical problem of getting the fuel here, because in the summer of 1940, they weren't very well organised with shipping stuff here. Other than armament, they weren't overly good at shipping things here because they just didn't have the ships. They were gradually utilising ships they'd captured elsewhere or bringing down barges from the Rhine, but they still didn't have a great deal of shipping going on in the summer of 1940. So getting the fuel here would, to use it in great numbers would have been a bit of a nightmare.
Yes. Okay. So, but you tell me that this little interchange has boosted your blog incredibly.
Well, yeah, shared. There was an RAF air raid from the Channel Islands. We talked about it in the pilot episode, I think, or certainly in June 1941, on Italy, believe it or not, which was staged through the Channel Islands. That article I shared because I thought it might be of interest to the person that had asked James the question anyway. And yeah, it just went mad. I think 500 people read that article in less than
500 additional people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wrote the article ages ago. Yeah. But yeah, 500 people read that.
Okay,
in less than 24 hours. But
at the end of the programme, we'll sort of give the usual heads up on where people can find the blog. Okay, now back to fortifications, pure and simple. We talked about how the Germans invested in the existing pre-Napoleonic and Napoleonic fortifications. We were talking primarily around the south of the island where there had been the commando pressure early on. You want to talk about other fortifications that the Germans utilised, I think, or enhanced, there might be a better word. So what have you got to tell us about that?
Yeah, I thought we'd take a look at the other end. We'd look at the northern end of the island where we're sitting right now as we record this, and where I've spent a big chunk of my life as of you. And I thought we'll talk about some of the stuff down this end of the island because it's slightly different to what you find up in the upper barracks in terms of fortifications that were already here, because there aren't really any big forts up in the south of the island that were constructed during Napoleonic era. There were, of course, loophole towers and things like that up there, and a few fortifications, gun batteries, etc., that were built during the Napoleonic times. But down here in the north, and on the west coast, we've got some full-on forts, proper Napoleonic fortifications, which the Germans took one look at and thought, oh, those would be handy. Not least because they had barracks in a lot of them. So the likes of Fort Le Marchant, which sits at the end of what is now our rifle range, that had a barracks building in it, in common with other fortifications around the island. All of those barracks buildings, they've all gone because they were neglected during the post-war period and became too dangerous.
Yes, and for listeners, these fortifications are built of Guernsey granite and were quite substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Germans took one look at some of them and they're like, what's not to like about a 20-foot thick granite wall? That'll do nicely.
Yes, and of course the troops that had utilised them in up until Battle of Waterloo, 1815, and obviously after that Napoleon disappeared actively from the scene. They did go into neglect, but they were manned by the Guernsey militia and with also British garrisons coming over and being rotated through the island. But really, I suppose, from 1815 up until the Entente Cordiale was signed with France, First World War, they were generally neglected. They were manned, I think, in the First World War in a very not casual way, but desultory way. But the Germans were in there, and they did add to them, Nick, didn't they? Yeah,
the Germans did. They took one look at them, thought these are going to be a good starting point. So they did add to them in terms of sandbags, obviously modern weapons. So quite a few. If you've watched war movies, MG34 machine guns, which was the forerunner of the MG42. So that's a machine gun that you use. It's not just one that you carry around and fire yourself. That requires a machine gun crew. They used those. They heavily sandbagged in the first instance, and also built things like wooden platforms to utilize for slightly heavier guns. So 2 centimeter anti-aircraft guns. They built platforms. There was one off of the side of the lighthouse in the harbour, which I've seen a photograph of. It just looks really odd. I'm not sure. Obviously, they tested it and made sure it was safe for them to put all that weight on it. But
there was also one attached to the water tower opposite the Trellard Hotel.
Yeah.
Because I think someone fell out of it. Did a German?
Yeah, somebody fell out of it and died.
Yeah,
I think that was during the construction of it, actually.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That someone fell and died.
Yeah, because this water tower, for those that obviously can't picture it, it's just near the Trellard Hotel. The Trellard Hotel played host to Panzer Division officers.
Behind the hotel.
But it's on the flight path to the airport as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that water tower is quite tall. I can't remember how tall it is exactly, but it is quite tall. It's got to be. It's over 100 feet, I would have thought.
Yeah, quite substantial. So, again, I must emphasise we're talking about the pre-Atlantic War period. So that we see Hitler getting involved in all of that. They moving to fortify or enhance the fortifications that have been left here. Because of the feared Napoleonic invasion of the Channel Islands, we then, Nick, we see other people getting involved. Hitler's staff getting involved, notably here in October 1941. Jodl makes an appraisement of the fortifications, and this is people would be familiar with the name. He's a senior ranking.
Yeah.
On what
executed in 1946. But yeah, he did an appraisement in October 1941. I think it was published on the 8th of October, and basically he was looking at it and saying we need more long-range guns, more anti-aircraft guns, more ammunition, more French mainland-based Luftwaffe squadrons in order to provide cover over the islands.
Yeah, so they would provide umbrella cover over the islands. One of the things here, he says, infantry levels must be brought up to divisional strength. Female workers and construction workers must be armed. So female workers?
Yeah, but by workers they mean they're effectively overseers. That's where they're talking about arming them. It's not the people that are being made to build the.
No, this is organisation talk.
Yeah, it's the OT workers.
The OT workers,
effectively the overseers that would be armed.
Yeah, and again, more ships to carry building materials, as you say. Now, when I talk to people that are interested in the occupation, in my capacity, working for museum services, people sort of say to me, "Well, they got such a thing as cement mines over here. Where did all the concrete come from?" And it had to be brought in. There was no stock of cement here to build all of the fortifications. Even then, as I say, it predated the Atlantic War. These came in on barges, didn't they? And they would have been attacked by the RAF.
So. Yeah, very much so. The shipping was harassed by the RAF on a frequent basis, particularly in 1941, because of course they had to either bring the stuff up from St Malo or from the slightly nearer ports, from Cherbourg, etc. But that caused real problems for them, because they were constantly being attacked. The Germans had flak ships that they put in the harbours to try and defend against aerial attacks on the ships while they were in the harbour. You get to later in the war, and there were quite a few bombing attacks on the harbour. January 1942, for instance, there was a bombing raid on the harbour then. But later on in the war, there were much more frequent bombing raids in 1944. But going back to this sort of time period, they were using barges, and some of them were just being towed. Some of them had their own motors. There were a lot of armed trawler vessels. So, what looked like your typical fishing trawler, but it had a couple of anti-aircraft guns bolted onto it, and they were used as sort of escort vessels, as it were, or just patrol boats just to go around the islands, just to keep an eye on the fishermen, or just keep an eye out for other shipping and stuff like that in the early days, because they didn't have the numbers of other boats that they could use. The E-boats used to come here on an infrequent basis. They were never based here, but they did stop over from time to time. But this was before that. They just used those.
Yes, I see also this appraisement that Jodl did. He presented this to Hitler, and Hitler actually himself added that flamethrowers must be set up on the island, and requested that the minefields be made more extensive, and the air defences must be able to last out a 14-day battle. So this is demonstrates the fact that Hitler himself was personally involved in retaining the islands and was going into detail.
Yeah.
I mean, air defences that must be able to last out a 14-day battle. So this is an assumption that that there would be a prolonged attack on, a sustained and prolonged attack by the British on the islands that early in the war.
Yeah, he had visions of it being a bit like Malta, and there'd be a siege effectively of the islands. Ironically, there was a siege effectively, but it was not quite how he expected it. Later on, unfortunately, in 1944-45. Interestingly, about the minefields. Now there were minefields already laid pre this, albeit not that numerous, but this led to more mines being laid, and you get to the point in November 1941, so only about a month after this, that any military strategist is fairly happy that there were sufficient landmines in Guernsey, to defend it. You didn't need any more. There were about 13,000. By the time you get to the end of the war, it's a completely crazy number that they end up pulling up. It's like 65,000. I think it's 65,301. It definitely ends in a 1. I remember that,
and it's still out there,
and it's still 65,000. But that I just find it amazing that they cleared 65,301 mines between the liberation on 9th of May and the end of July 1945. But talking about the minefields though, in October 1941, when they were busy adding more minefields as per the orders, they put telemines and S-mines. So I think we may have touched on what the difference between those is. Telemines were primarily anti-tank. They're the ones that are sort of flat round things that you bury in the ground, and it'll go off if you drive over it or whatever. The S-mines are those horrible ones which have got lots of ball bearings in them, and
they spring up or something and distribute at waist height or something.
Yeah, they do. So they could be set off various ways. You can set them up with a tripwire, or they've just had prongs on the top, and if you stepped on it and you lifted your foot off, the thing would jump up to about waist height. 360 ball bearings come whizzing at you, which is why during some of the commando raids where they found themselves in minefields, the guys that were crawling along the ground were largely unhurt if they triggered mines, because they'd gone up to waist height and the ball bearings were flying, sort of above them, and it tended to be anybody that was standing up that was in the radius. So they put these in, and I did some bit of research and wrote an article that you can find on the blog, which was about the minefield at Roos, so out on Roos Headland, which is a popular place for people to go swimming off the pier there, and there's a nice kiosk there where you can get a cup of tea or coffee, and there's also a loophole tower there, and the Germans decided they were going to defend that area of minefields. It goes back to what we were talking about in the previous episode about the locals were basically excluded from going to a lot of the coastal areas, so they put a minefield, mix of telemines and S-mines down there in November 1941.
Excuse me.
And unlike other minefields in Guernsey, they did have an accident there. There seemed to be quite a few accidents early on involving minefields, and this one was no different. So they laid quite a big minefield there, and on the 7th of November, a major I can't pronounce German names, but I'll give it a go. I think it's Blaschek or something like that. Anyway, he went to inspect the minefield that his men had been working on the day before. He got there, realised, well, there's nobody working on the minefield. It was lunchtime. He thought, well, they've gone off to get their lunch. So he inspected the fencing around the edge of the minefield. All good so far. Then he stepped into the minefield to go and inspect it. He thought the minefield was not live yet because it was still being worked on. I've got a copy of the map for the minefield, and it was signed off on the 6th of November as being active. So
which part of the island was this?
This is at Roos.
Oh, right,
yeah,
yes, Roos, of course. Yes.
Yeah, on the headland there.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you can still see some of the markers there because...
In fact, there was a tragedy at the end, towards the end of the war, where a local felt that he needed to supplement his food supply and believed that the minefields didn't actually exist and that it was only the notices that existed, and that led to a fatality. But we'll get onto that when we get there. Yeah,
so... it had been signed off by an officer on the 6th of November, the day before, as being active. So he walked into the minefield thinking it wasn't live. It was. He set off an S-mine. He was really badly injured. He was actually rescued by the company sergeant major, Schultz, and despite being badly wounded, they got him to hospital, and they thought he might survive to start off with, but he died in later on that day. Schultz got an award because he'd basically walked into a live minefield to go and rescue this officer. So that was one of the downsides, of course, of putting minefields in. Is there were a number of times during the occupation where locals and others, wandered into minefields inadvertently. But as I say, down at Roos, you can still see where some of the markers were because, as I've mentioned a few times before, the Germans like to recycle things. So they used a lot of the ordnance board markers, the granite posts that you can see with the ordnance sign on them. They used those as boundary markers for the minefield, and also so they'd measure the minefield out. I can put something on the show notes.
There's an incredible series of books, the Festung Guernsey books, that have run into, I think, 10 volumes. The book. They're still being published, and they give in colour. They give sections of the Guernsey. Well, the whole island of Guernsey, and it's quite instructive to walk along the paths, coastal paths on the cliffs, and you can actually set this sort of the minefields over the map of where you're walking, and they've got quite a spread, and it's quite remarkable now to walk in these areas as we can and think about how they were defended and all of the work to put the mines in, and then to bring the mines back. And in fact, wasn't somebody given an order to destroy all the records of the minefield so the Allies wouldn't be able to find the mines? A German officer knew that the Allies would arrive, but someone hid a copy. That's my thinking.
Quite possibly. I got the copy of the minefield at Roos from the guys at Jersey War Tours. I know a couple of the guys from there. I interact with them on social media and also by email. And I mentioned that I was looking at minefields, and one of the guys there was actually down at the archive in Jersey, and said, "Well, I've just got a copy of some minefield maps for Guernsey. Do you want me to see if you got the one that you're interested in?" And sure enough, did have the one that I'm interested in. So it came from Jersey, the one that I used to look at. I don't think my other half was overly impressed because we went down to go and have a look, and I wanted to take some photographs at Roos, and I gave her the map, and she was sort of standing there looking at it, saying, "Well, what is this?" And I just casually dropped into conversation to Katie that it was a minefield map, and we were stood in the middle of where the minefield was.
Again, this is. I think it really does bring us home to us. Where we go. It's got this incredible prehistory of 85 years ago or so. Maybe in your blog, Nick, we can put some details of books, the Festung Guernsey series, and also, of course, Ernie Gavet's book about the fortifications here. That's been further revised. I mean, that's a terrific book. I mean, people can look this up, get it direct from the publishers, or on Amazon or other places. But
I'll
if
put
you're
some links
interested, and what I find with these books, Nick, is it sparks other interests, sort of peripheral interests. Once you see these maps, once you see, for example, where I spend 5 days a week, I'm fortunate to spend 5 days a week at Fort Grey on Guernsey's south-west coast. That in itself, we call it the cup and saucer. You just need to see a photograph to understand why. Fort Grey. But I mean, that had an enormous, that had 4 anti-aircraft guns. It had a pack gun and it had a machine gun and it's a relatively small area, but there were quite a lot of men there. And so these defences, they were serious.
Oh yeah.
And again, of course, this is a Napoleonic fort, and people are quite astounded when I explain to them that probably the only time that shots were ever fired in anger were by the German forces, because in Napoleonic times we didn't suffer an invasion, we didn't suffer any attacks, and they were highly effective in being preventative.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if sitting at Fort Grey, you were in the middle of the bay there. You had Leray Headland was very heavily fortified around by Liu Island there. That had lots of mines. They obviously later on built the big tower there.
This is the Kriegsmarine observation tower.
Yeah, the Kriegsmarine observation tower there. But if you here's one for anybody that's actually in Guernsey, or if you visit Guernsey, if you go out to the headland there at Leray, in front of the tower, you can't go to the tower because that's on private property. But if you walk towards the tower from the car park by Liu, and go to the left-hand side by the tower there are actually German trenches there.
Yeah, the trench systems. They're incredible. Yeah.
You can still walk through it. It depends, obviously, if the weeds and stuff have been cut back. But this time of year they'll have been cut back. You can walk through the trench system there.
Yeah, in fact, I got chatting to. I think I'm talking about my meeting with Edem, if you're listening, based in a travel journalist who lives in Spain, Iraqi travel journalist, and I gave him a lift out to Fort Summery. And so he was due to have a look round. So here's a shout out to you, Eden, if you're listening in rural Spain. Hopefully you'll be publishing and influencing people to come to see our lovely island.
Was he here recently?
Yes, he was.
I think I might have seen him then, because there was a chap recording on his phone at the memorial service for John Saville, the Typhoon pilot.
Oh right, yeah.
And I just wonder if it was him, because I happened to see him a bit later on, again taking some photographs and recording a bit of video on his phone, talking about the raid. So I just wonder if it was him.
Yeah, well, he took one of our cards when I was at Fort Grey, and he was very influenced in the occupation period. And later on, when I left, he was walking along the coast, so I said, hop in. And I gave him a lift out to see that. So hopefully he walked around that trench system. I mean, here's a shout out for anybody interested in the Second World War. Guernsey is an incredible place to come and stay. I mean, you've not only got the occupation period, but you've also got the French period, and we've got all layers of our history. And should you ever need a guide, I'm sure Nick and I would be more than happy to take you around to some of our favourite pieces of concrete. Okay, so really, where we're looking at now, the point that Hitler has personally intervened, and he's talking about these. He ordered that there should be up to 250 strong points on Guernsey and Jersey, and that the walls were to be up to 2 meters thick. I mean, this again shows how much detail he was delving into. And there were to be various anti-paratroop devices installed across the island. Now, Landcrest Common in the north of the island, excuse me, common areas where the golf course is, They had huge poles erected there with a chap that's passed. I think I've mentioned him before, Ron Sabir. They had chains across, and I think they suspended landmines from these chains. It was to stop gliders landing, I think.
Yeah, it was, and it did cause problems because you got cows that wandered into these areas. They were grazing and wandered into these areas and inadvertently set off these things. Later on in the war, people were getting desperate for wood. The Germans put out notices because there were people that were just risking their lives to get some of the wood from these by chopping them down. The Germans were more bothered about the fact they thought it was sabotage rather than the fact that these people were just desperate for fuel for their fires. So there were all sorts of things around it. Hitler was obsessed with the fact that whilst the British may not definitely try and retake the islands, he was convinced there would be a lot of raids, and probably more than there were. It wasn't misguided in the fact that there were talks about retaking the islands. That happened a number of times. You've got we'll be talking about in the coming months. Operation Attaboy, which was the first look at the possibility of retaking the islands and how that played out. Later on, there was Op Blazing and a few other bits and pieces like that. So it wasn't totally misguided, but he really didn't need to put that level of fortifications, have those built on the island. Now, his justification was it was of considerable importance. The islands were of considerable importance to our escort traffic, which I'm not really sure it was, to be honest. It was useful for submarines and things like that. They used to turn the lighthouse at the Casquettes on to guide submarines down towards their submarine bases and stuff between on the French coast if they were coming back in from the Atlantic. But other than that, it just really wasn't.
Yeah, but if we lived in an alternative universe and the Germans decided not to invade the Channel Islands, one wonders then if, because they had nobody here, would the British have come back? I mean,
well, you don't know, do you?
We just don't. I mean, it's the natural order of things that they did come here, the Germans, that is. And just going back to the glider, anti-glider defences on Landcrest Common, the same Ron Sabir told me once he was out walking because he lived next to Bale Church, which is just in that part of the island. He saw a German officer exercising his German Shepherd, and the poor dog, once a stick had been thrown, jumped up and knocked one of the mines, and there was no more German Shepherd. This happened right in front of Ron.
They did use some of Landcrest for exercising their horses, though, so it can't have been over the entirety of Landcrest.
No, that's right. I think it would have been in just the areas that would have
strategic.
Would have absolutely purposely, obviously been suitable for gliders to land. Okay, so that sort of wraps up now our talk on two specials on the fortresses. We will return back to our timetable. I think our next monthly program is February
1941.
41. But also we have another special. You've done an interview, Nick,
I did,
and recorded it. Give us some background to that.
I did. A lady who was here during the occupation. She was an absolute pleasure to talk to. Absolutely fascinating. She worked in various jobs, Red Cross Message Bureau. She was a nurse.
And the lady's name?
Melva Stacey. So that will be coming up shortly. We'll have that. I talked to her for about 40 minutes. And it was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that.
Okay, so that's the end of this 45-minute special, second part. We'll move on to Melva's story. We'll record that, and that will go out shortly. Then we return back to our February 41 and onwards and upwards.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you again, Nick. Your blog is called...
islandfortress.com. You can find all sorts of things about the occupation on there, and I'll put up some pictures and relevant documents from this discussion.
Yeah, and listeners, if they liked music from the war years, they can listen on Gnet Radio Mixcloud to a musical program, musical supplement to Islands at War, called Rough and Rowdy Times, presented by yours truly, Keith Pengelly. So it's goodbye from me, Keith, and Nick.
Yeah, and goodbye from me as well. Thanks for listening.
Yep, thank you. We'll have our outro music now. Thanks. Stay safe, and we'll be with you shortly.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.